Good evening. I'm Tiara Curry. I'm a senior scientist in our Saving Life on Earth campaign, and thank you for joining us for our weekly speaker series webinar. That's a deep dive with our staff to learn more about the many ways we're working to end extinction. Tonight, for our Saving Life on Earth webinar, we're going to talk about scary creatures and even scarier attempts to take away their protections. But before we get started, I want to share some good news with you from this week. We won a legal battle in an ongoing fight to stop a massive warehouse in Southern California that would harm the San Jacinto Wildlife Management Area. It's home to burrowing owls, raptors, and a lot of other imperiled species. Also in California, we gained legal protection for a corridor in Riverside County that's incredibly important for the dispersal of Santa Ana mountain lions. A court in Washington state sided with us and said that the state can no longer issue permits to use hounds or bait to kill black bears on timberlands. A federal appeals court today blocked construction for a coal mine expansion in a roadless area in Colorado's Gunnison National Forest. We also filed a lot of lawsuits this week. We filed a lawsuit to stop 1.7 million acres of fossil fuel leasing in Colorado, to stop leopards from being imported by trophy hunters, to stop toxic discharges from Lake Okeechobee in Florida, and we challenged the approval of a new fungicide that is highly toxic to freshwater fish, including salmon. You likely already heard that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service today announced that they're delisting gray wolves in the lower 48 states. Next week's webinar is going to be all about wolves and our plans to help save them and how you can help. So look for an invitation from Diane on Sunday morning on how you can get involved in the battle to help protect wolves. And finally, it's Bat Week, and I'm so excited. Bats are underappreciated, but they're so important. They're important as animals in their own right, but they also provide billions of dollars of pest control services by eating insects. In some ecosystems, they play a really important role in pollination. A study in a tropical dry forest in Mexico found 19 different types of pollen on the fur of a single bat. The Centers had a Save Our Bats campaign for decades. I've worked on that a little bit, and so has Ryan, who you're going to meet in a minute. I want to show you, I forgot to show you the good news. Here's the good news slides, the burrowing owl and the black bear and the salmon that are better off now, the wolf campaign, and here's the bats. All right, so on the right side of this is this photo is by Matthew Niemiller, who said we could use his picture tonight. This is a bat we're trying to get Endangered Species Act protection for. Up on the top of the screen is the Indiana bat mural that we put up in Cincinnati, Ohio as part of our Endangered Species mural project. Roger Pete painted that. And our speaker tonight, Ryan, is going to tell you in detail about his work to get stronger protections for northern long-eared bats. The other bat on the screen with the big ears is the Florida Bonneted Bat. We're working to get critical habitat protection for it in Florida. After tonight's webinar, you're going to get an email with an action alert that you can take to help protect bats. The Army Corps of Engineers is trying to fast track permitting through streams and wetlands for pipelines, coal mines, and other harmful projects without considering the impacts on endangered species. So you can respond to this email and tell them that that's a terrible idea. I want to show you some other scary, creepy, but entirely lovable creatures that the center is working to protect. And I know these animals aren't really scary. Nothing's as scary as Extinction, but I picked out the scariest one that I could to keep with the Halloween theme. So this is the orange-foot pimpleback pearly mussel. It's amazing. It's my favorite mussel. Like many endangered freshwater mussels, it used to be widespread, but now there's only 2 surviving reproducing populations. 38 species of freshwater mussels have already been lost to extinction in North America, and the center is working to gain protection for dozens and dozens of freshwater mussels. This is the Hellbender Salamander. It's also called the snot otter, devil dog, or mud devil. It's North America's longest salamander at 2 feet long. It has these creepy toe pads that help it cling to rocks on river bottoms, and it really needs clean water to survive. It was recently denied Endangered Species Act protection, but we're going to keep fighting to get protection for hellbenders in the rivers that they call home. Okay, here are some cave creatures, and honestly, these can be a little scary. Ryan is going to tell you all about the bone cave harvestmen. We're working to gain protection for 45 little-known, underappreciated cave species. Just a few years ago in Kentucky, the Tatum cave beetle was declared extinct, we sort of upped our campaign to help cave species because they have a very small range, but they're highly imperiled. This is the eastern black reel. It recently gained ESA protection as a threatened species, but it didn't get critical habitat, and we think that its protection should be stronger. It's threatened by wetland destruction, sea level rise, and oil and gas development, and it's likely to be extinct in the next 50 years unless it gets more protection. Its red eyes are creepy, but climate change is even more terrifying. And finally, the wolverine. It was just denied ESA protection again, and we filed a lawsuit challenging the denial again. So we're going to save time for your questions at the end. If we don't get to your question tonight, we'll be on Slack tomorrow from 12 to 1 Pacific. In the email you get after the webinar, there's instructions on how to join Slack and the action alert that you can take to help bats and other species. Now, I'm going to hand it over to Ryan. He's our Endangered Species Act defense attorney. And as you might imagine, he is very busy these days. So Ryan, tell us about yourself and your work.
Yeah, hi everyone, and thanks, Tiara. So my name is Ryan Shannon. I'm a staff attorney in the Center's Endangered Species Program. And in my work, I look to protect the Endangered Species Act and imperiled species, essentially just trying to get those species protected under the Act and then to ensure that those protections remain robust and don't fall to deregulatory actions or industry attacks. So prior to joining the center in 2017, I was a legal fellow with Earthrise Law Center at Lewis and Clark Law School. It's an environmental litigation clinic. I graduated from Lewis and Clark Law School in 2015, and prior to that, I got my bachelor's degree at UC Santa Cruz. I'm originally from Chicago, but after moving to Santa Cruz and seeing some mountains, I never went back. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about 2 recent victories and 1 upcoming fight. And while all the species I'm talking about today may seem spooky, you really learn to love them once you get to know them. So the first one I'm going to talk to you about is the northern long-eared bat. They're pretty cute. They've got these enormous long ears, as their name suggests. And the northern long-eared bat once ranged from along the eastern seaboard throughout the Northeast and then into the Midwest. And then they kind of range into the Western states and the Rockies, but their numbers really get pretty sparse the farther west you go. And scientists think that those bats actually might winter further east, and you're just seeing summer migrants kind of dispersing into like the Rocky states, Montana, Colorado, Wyoming, and the like. The core of their range historically was in the Northeast, around New York, Vermont, and the like. As the name suggests, the bat's most prominent feature is its long ears. They're relatively small in size with a wingspan of around 9 inches and a total length of about 3.7 inches. In the winter, they hibernate in caves and mine called hibernacula. And then in the spring, pregnant females migrate to isolated roosts or colonies underneath barks or cavities in both live trees and snags. Next slide, please. So unfortunately, as is the case with a lot of other species, but probably most pronounced with northern long-eared bats, northern long-eared bats have been completely devastated by white nose syndrome, which you can see in this picture on the right. So it's a fungus and it infects bats when they hibernate. It really thrives in the cold climates like caves and mines and the hibernacula that bats call home during the winter. And it just kind of slowly eats away at the bat. And a healthy bat can fight them off, but as they're trying to survive hibernation, they really burn through their fat stores and the like. And so white nose syndrome can result in stupor or bats waking up far too early and then trying to go out and feed on their main, on insects. They're, what makes up the vast majority of the diet. And because it's still winter, there's just no prey available. And unfortunately, they die. And since white nose syndrome was detected in upstate New York in 2006, it is very rapidly spread across the vast majority of the bats range, with only one state, Louisiana, not having any detected white nose syndrome to date across the bat's entire range. And it's just incredibly devastating. There is not a single known case of a northern long-eared bat surviving white nose syndrome. And in the core of its range in New York, where it's been detected, it's essentially led to colony collapse, and where they once might have seen thousands of species or thousands of bats in a cave in years past, now none remain. They're virtually extinct in the core of their range. So that's by and away the largest threat to the species, but they're also threatened by forest management, energy development, contaminants, and climate change. And while those threats before the arrival of white nose syndrome may not have been enough to put them in a position where they needed the Endangered Species Act's protections, now that so few bats remain, these smaller cumulative impacts really pose an existential threat. And that was at issue in the case that we filed challenging the threatened listing. So next slide, please. So we have been working to protect northern long-eared bats for just over 10 years now. We first petitioned the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to list them as endangered back in 2010. This was after the arrival of white nose syndrome in New York in 2006. And as I think everyone was kind of waking up to what an existential threat white nose syndrome was for bat species like the northern long-eared bat. Now, the Endangered Species Act requires the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to act on a citizen petition to list the species within 2 years. But unfortunately, that almost never happens. And delay, on the order of 10 years or more is quite common. So in the case of the bat, it took them 3 years before they even proposed to list it as an endangered species, recognizing the threat of white nose syndrome. However, after the proposed rule went out, industry groups really got organized and put immense political pressure on the Obama administration and members of Congress to put pressure on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to not list the bat as endangered. And because of that, the service backtracked and in 2015 listed the bat as a threatened species with what is called a Section 4D rule rather than as endangered. And so to give you a quick overview, endangered species enjoy all of the protections provided by the Endangered Species Act, and most namely protection from take. I think this is what most people think about when they think about the protections provided by the Endangered Species Act. It basically means you can't do anything to kill or harm a listed endangered species. However, the act doesn't automatically apply take prohibitions to threatened species. And for decades, there was a regulation effect called the blanket 4D rule that presumptively did extend all of those protections to threatened species. However, the service has always been able to issue species-specific 4D rules, which then lay out the specific protections or exemptions from protections that any given species enjoys. And in 2019, the Trump administration actually rolled back the blanket 4D rule. So now threatened species only receive the protections given to them under a species-specific 4D rule and no longer enjoy the broader protections provided to endangered species. And what we've seen since 2019 with this administration is it's now the rule that species get listed as threatened, with very permissive 4D rules that often allow most of the activities that were impacting the species prior to listing to continue after listing. So while a species may be listed and you can tout it as the success where it's going to gain some protections, in reality, the 4D rules allow the same behavior that was impacting them to continue. This has happened recently, for instance, with the eastern black rail that Tiara mentioned. There's a 4D rule that allows a significant amount of habitat destruction to continue, even though habitat destruction is the primary threat facing the eastern black rail. So we sued in order to get the bat the protections it needed, and won a ruling earlier this year, back in January, from Judge Sullivan, forcing the Fish and Wildlife Service to go back to the table and consider whether the bat needed to be listed as endangered. And there were two main grounds that he ruled in our favor on. One was when they listed as threatened, the Fish and Wildlife Service tried to play a bit of a shell game where they said, oh, well, it's not actually in danger of extinction right now because it still persists in 40% of its range, looking at this 40% of the geographic range that is the Western states. Well, that might make up 40% of the range's area, but it doesn't represent where the bat actually lives. And the truth was that the bat had been virtually eliminated from the Midwestern and Eastern states that make up the core of its range. And so while that only constitutes 60% of the area, it made up about 95% of the total population. So they truly had been devastated. And the judge said, you can't play these kind of shell games or logic games with endangered species protections. And then the other thing he took them to task on was failing to recognize the threats posed by the cumulative impacts from things like logging or wind energy development projects, saying that while they may not have posed an existential threat prior to the arrival of white nose syndrome, with the situation being what it is on the ground today, those small impacts can really have an oversized effect when you're dealing with only 3% of the population remaining since the arrival of white nose syndrome. So the service has to go back to the drawing board, and we're hopeful that it'll finally, the bat will finally receive the protections it needs. However, the service is dragging its feet, saying that they can't issue a new rule until late in 2023. And now we're back in court asking the judge to order them to provide these life-saving protections sooner rather than later, because by 2023, the game may be up. And so we're doing everything we can to get the bat the life-saving protections it needs as soon as possible.
And it's incredibly frustrating. Like when I look at coal mining permits or pipeline permits, even if they detect northern long-eared bats in the impact area, they say, oh, because of the 4D rule, we don't have to do anything to protect them. So we can blow up this mountain or whatever it is they're going to do. It's almost as if they weren't listed. The former rule was so permissive.
Yeah, often people look to threatened species and say, well, they are listed under the act, so that has to be better than nothing, right? But often they're listed in name only, and the activities that threaten them in the first place continue under these incredibly permissive 4D rules.
Well, I'm very grateful for your work to help bats. Now, tell us about the Bone Cave Harvestmen.
Okay, so the Bone Cave Harvestmen, easily the best name out of any species I've ever worked on. I always think about it kind of like this picture on the right. It sounds like it's going to be this huge, terrifying creature that lurks in caves and like snatches little kids or something like that. But in reality, if you go to the next slide, they are these very diminutive, bright orange harvestmen. And so harvestmen are not spiders. They are a separate genome, and the most common one is daddy longlegs. I think that's the one we kind of all grew up seeing in our backyards. I said genome, I meant genus. In our backyards, and they have a couple of key differences from spiders. They only have one body segment as opposed to two, and then they only have one set of eyes as opposed to the multiple set of eyes that spiders will have. So in reality, way less creepy than spiders. And they're virtually harmless. They basically survive off of nutrients that get washed into the caves during rainstorms, like crickets or just other, plant matter and the like. And so bone cave harvestmen are endemic to the area around Austin, Texas. Austin, Texas and its surrounding area sits on this really unique karst plateau. So the ground is primarily limestone, and it's incredibly porous. It erodes quite easily. And so the whole region is littered with caves and these underground aquifers. And there are tons of endemic species unique to the area in and around Austin, Texas. And one of them is these bone cave harvestmen. They were first listed as bee cave harvestmen in 1988. And then as more research was done on these species, they realized what they thought was one species was actually 5 different species, one of which was the bone cave harvestman. And so they amended their listing in 1993 to recognize the fact that they were a distinct species. And so we've been working to protect the bone cave harvestmen from a series of challenges brought by right-wing property rights groups, including the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And so what they went to court alleging is that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service lacked the legal authority to regulate bone cave harvestmen, or really regulate activities that might impact bone cave harvestmen, such as development, because they are a intrastate species. They're only found within the confines of one state. And so for a quick little civics lesson, the federal government, as we often hear, is a government with limited authority. It only has the authority that's granted to it by the Constitution, and all other authority is reserved to the states by the 10th Amendment. And so whenever Congress passes a law, it has to ground that law in some kind of constitutional authority. And one of the main ways that Congress does this is through their authority to regulate interstate commerce. And so the regulation of interstate commerce breaks down into 3 categories. You can regulate interstate commerce itself. So if I send a package from where I live in Oregon to my folks in Chicago, they can regulate that trade. You can regulate the channels of interstate commerce, so highways, planes, trains, and automobiles. And Congress can regulate any activity that has a substantial effect on interstate commerce in the aggregate. And so the famous case about this third prong is Worth v. Selden. It's an old case from the 1930s. And it said that Congress had the authority to regulate the wheat that Worth was growing in his backyard, because if they couldn't regulate the wheat grown in someone's backyard, then they couldn't effectively control wheat prices because he was keeping wheat off the market. And so they could even reach into someone's own backyard and regulate the wheat that was bound for their dinner table, just to kind of give you an idea of how far this authority can stretch. And as a quick aside as well, just on current events, with the recent nomination and confirmation of Justice Barrett, I think that there's some concern that these interstate commerce clause challenges may start cropping up again, and that this is something that the media hasn't paid a ton of attention to with her confirmation. Back in the 90s, under the conservative Rehnquist court, there were a handful of interstate commerce clause challenges that the court actually ruled in favor of and limited Congress's authority to regulate interstate commerce. And this was the first time that the Supreme Court had essentially done so since the New Deal era. Another thing that's been talked about quite a bit recently is potentially stacking the court. And back in the 20s and 30s, as the New Deal era was taking hold, FDR was passing all of these new laws, and the Supreme Court at first was striking them down, saying that Congress didn't have the authority to pass them under their Interstate Commerce Clause authority. And FDR basically threatened the court, saying, well, I'll just put 13 justices on the court, and once I have my justices on, all these laws will get passed. And then all of a sudden they quickly changed their tune and wrote Worth v. Selden, and we hadn't really seen any laws struck down on the basis of lacking authority under the Interstate Commerce Clause ever since. And this is the famous line of the switch in time that saved nine. Basically, the Supreme Court changing its tune to appease FDR, or otherwise he would have just stacked the court with 4 more justices so that he could have gotten his laws through the courts. So anyways, the Texas Public Policy Foundation challenged the Fish and Wildlife Service's authority to regulate the bone cave harvestmen, a solely intrastate species, saying that this species doesn't have a direct link to interstate commerce. And there's been a slew of these challenges over the years. They actually challenged Fish and Wildlife Service's authority to regulate the bone cave harvestmen itself back in 2006 and lost, and basically we're taking a second bite at the apple, cobbling together a couple of recent dissents from the Supreme Court. So we intervened in order to protect the bone cave harvestmen, and thankfully the district court with an opinion written by District Court Judge Eugene Lee Yeakel, which is the most Texas name one could possibly have, got it right and upheld protections for the bone cave harvestmen, finding that the Fish and Wildlife Service's authority to regulate intrastate species like the bone cave harvestmen was essential to their ability to carry out the functions of the Endangered Species Act to protect endangered and threatened species, and that the ESA, being a statute that regulates commerce like trade in endangered and threatened species, since it has a substantial effect on interstate commerce, this was well within the Fish and Wildlife Service's authority. Apologies if that's a little convoluted. And it's really true. Under the Endangered Species Act, upwards of 84% of the species protected exist only in one state. And so if a court were to find that the service lacked the authority to regulate intrastate species, it really would gut their ability to protect listed species. And then you would see the kind of ecosystem collapse that Congress was worried about when it passed the Endangered Species Act. And so the PPF then appealed, and the Fifth Circuit a few months back again ruled in our favor, this time saying that their challenges were barred by what's called the Statute of Limitations. So it's a legal principle that basically says you only have so long to bring a legal claim. If your neighbor does something you don't like, you can't just sit on it forever and then 15 years down the line sue him for being a jerk. You only have a limited period of time, basically when the injury is fresh, to bring your challenge. And for the Endangered Species Act, that time limitation is 6 years. And so the Fifth Circuit said, well, if you're trying to argue that the service lacks the authority to regulate the species that they listed back in 1988, you had to bring your challenge before 1994, and you're far too late now. Back in, I think they actually filed their lawsuit in 2017, but regardless, well outside of 6 years since the Bone Cave Harvestman was first protected under the Act. And unfortunately, the story's still not over. Actually, just this Monday, TPPF submitted their petition to the Supreme Court asking them to take up the case. And so we'll have to wait and see what the Supreme Court does. They really only take up a very small percentage of the cases on appeal from the federal circuits, less than 1%. And given that the Fifth Circuit ruled on these procedural grounds, the statute of limitation grounds, rather than the kind of more interesting interstate commerce clause issue, I'm hopeful that they won't take it up, but we'll just have to wait and see. We'll probably know sometime this spring after we've all briefed the case again.
Wow, Ryan, thank you for your work defending a little cave creature that most of us will never get to see, but that most of the people on this webinar care about. Next, we're going to talk about the American burying beetle, and it's kind of a big deal at the center because it's our executive director's favorite species. We have a staff member who actually wrote a song for it, and a couple of years ago we had a parade in Portland where we made a big one and carried it through the streets. So I guess if we had a mascot that wasn't a frog or a polywear, where I would argue for the Hellbender Salamander, would probably be the American burying beetle. So tell us about the beetle and about your work to protect it.
Sure. So the American burying beetle really is a fascinating species. Tiara, could you go to the next slide? So as you can see, they have this really distinctive bright orange coloring and these kind of like furry antennae. And I get why Karan loves it so much. It's become one of my favorites as well, just because they're so unique. So they are a bit gruesome in how they survive. So the American burying beetle, after it sniffs out a freshly dead animal from up to 2 miles away, joins a mate in burying the carcass, usually in like an abandoned den, like a vole den or something like that. And it's kind of fascinating how they get it there. What they'll do is they'll get on their backs and they pass it off from one to the other in tandem until they actually get it down into the burrow where it's safe for them to then strip it of its fur and feathers, roll it into a ball, and cover it in oral and anal fluids to preserve it for a shelter for their larvae. And the American burying beetle's unique in that it's one of the few insects that actually sticks around to care for its young after they hatch. And Karan does a really great impression of one. If you ever see him, you should ask him to do it for you. But the American burying beetle, while it was once very widespread, faced collapse largely due, they think in large part, because of the extinction of the passenger pigeon. You know, the passenger pigeon was once this incredibly widespread species across the United States, and it provided kind of the perfect sized dead body for an American burying beetle. And with their collapse, along with a host of other reasons like agricultural conversion, development, oil and gas development, and climate change, the American burying beetle's population has really disappeared across the vast majority of the range. And today they are believed to be extinct in all but 9 states in the US and likely are extinct from Canada. and now only occur in this region like Texas, Arkansas, Kansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, South Dakota, and then a bit randomly on a small island off the coast of Rhode Island. And then there's another reintroduced population on Nantucket Island off the coast of Massachusetts. And then one more population in Southwest Missouri, which again is another reintroduced population. And so ever since it had been listed years ago, it slowly has been recovering. These kind of scattered populations have continued to survive, but they haven't really thrived. It's been a slow slog to see if it can expand at all, kind of beyond these last few remaining toeholds. And there's some reasons to think that there's just structural things in place now that kind of prevent it from doing so. It just doesn't do well in any area that's been converted to oil and gas development or agriculture, because it really needs undisturbed soil to reproduce in. And so if you're tilling the soil every year, to plant a new corn crop or anything like that, an American bearing beetle just can't survive in that area anymore. And shockingly, despite its continued absence from most of its range, and really not much changing since it was listed as endangered, this administration has now downlisted it from endangered to threatened. And as I mentioned earlier, this allows them to promulgate a species-specific 4D rule that allows a lot of the activities that were once prohibited or more closely controlled for endangered species. It allows those activities now to proceed under this very permissive 4D rule. So it's going to allow a lot more oil and gas development and residential development in the small remaining area of this species range. The downlisting also is tinged with a bit of controversy. About 2 years ago, I got a tip from a scientist through LinkedIn, actually, of all places. It was actually useful for something. Saying that he had been kicked off of the team of biologists that was preparing the species status assessment report. Basically, he had done some research talking about how land conversion impacts American bearing beetle that the team was using to kind of model impacts across its range. And he thought that his work was being misused and misrepresented by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for the sake of this downlisting. But when he voiced his disagreements with them, they kicked him off the team. And so now we're looking to challenge this downlisting in court sometime in the near future. And that is that from me.
All right, thanks for telling us all about the American burying beetle. Is there any good news you want to share with us? It seems like you work on a lot of heavy cases, and I kind of pinholed you into bats, beetles, and harvestmen. Is there any of your other work you want to share with us real briefly?
Well, I think the good news is that our work and our efforts to protect endangered and threatened species have been overall very successful. And we have been able to get the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to provide essential protections for endangered and threatened species, despite their unwillingness to do so. Some recent victories would be the northern long-eared bat, for one. Hopefully it's on its way to endangered listing now, following Judge Sullivan's good ruling in January. And we've retained protections for the bone cave harvestmen. But we've also recently gotten, as a result of our lawsuits, protections for the eastern black rail, that was mentioned earlier. And then if you want a decidedly not scary creature, recently got protections for the humboldt martin, which probably is the cutest creature that I've ever worked on. So I think the good news and the takeaway is that through our work and through our litigation, we've actually been able to obtain meaningful protections for hundreds of species.
The Humboldt martin is absolutely terrifying if you're a chipmunk or a stellar jay or a squirrel.
That's true. That's
just
true.
saying.
It's subjective.
So what gives you hope?
What gives me hope is that with the Endangered Species Act, Congress, with broad bipartisan support and the continued support of the vast majority of Americans, we can continue to protect these species and fight against extinction. And that we have been able to do so despite the numerous attacks against the Endangered Species Act, either through downlisting or through kind of collateral attacks like TPPF's Interstate Commerce Clause attack. But so far on things like the Interstate Commerce Clause, we're batting 1,000%, and we've been able to uphold the act in front of numerous court of appeals. And so that gives me hope that we've succeeded in defending the act, and that the act continues to prevent extinction, saving 99% of the species that are listed.
How can our members help?
I think right now, although you've probably heard it a million times from other folks, the most important thing to do is just get out and vote, and then also hold our elected representatives accountable. It doesn't matter if it's a Democratic or a Republican administration. There will always be pushback against endangered species receiving the protections they need. I mean, case in point is the northern long-eared bat. It was the Obama administration under intense political pressure that caved and listed them as threatened rather than endangered. So I'd just say go out and vote, and then make sure that your representatives know that you care about endangered species.
Thanks, Ryan. And now we're going to take some questions. If we don't get to your question tonight, Ryan and I will be on Slack tomorrow from 12 to 1 Pacific in the Endangered Species channel. And in the email you'll get after this webinar, there's a link to an action alert you can take and instructions on how to join Slack. All right. Questions. This is kind of specific. Is there any progress in medical treatment for white nose syndrome for bats, or research being done to help since it can't recover in its own way?
There has been a little bit of progress, but the problem is that there's no effective means of delivering the handful of treatments that have been shown to be effective. So you'd have to go and treat each individual bat so far. And so it's just not scalable, unfortunately. They've tried a couple other things, like UV light can kill the fungus, but again, the problem is that they'll hibernate in these little nooks and crannies and caves. So even if you set up a UV light within the cave, it's hard to actually get coverage for all the bats. So now the most recent thing that Bat Conservation International is trying is what they call a fatback program. So essentially, one of the leading causes of mortality is they wake up early and they go out looking for insects, and there's none available because it's still winter. So what they're going to try, I think this coming spring, is to essentially just put out almost like a bird feeder food for the bats as they leave the cave. They'll just be these balls of dead insects that they can chow down on, and hopefully that'll allow them to restore some of the nutrients they need and then fight off the disease into the summer.
Someone asked about forest management projects and how that threatens these bats.
So in the summer, the pregnant females roost in these trees. They call them maternity roosts. So if you're like looking up into a tree, there'll be like a piece of bark or something that's peeled off a little bit, or maybe it's a snag, and so there's a cavity, you know, a hollow part in the center of the tree. And that's where they will stay as they give birth to their young. And so the forest practices can harm them because they cut down those trees, or they disturb them while they're trying to give birth and raise their young, kind of during a really critical period of their life cycle. And then wind energy projects, another one of the main threats, really messes with their echolocation. The noise and the vibration generated by the turbines really harms their ability to locate prey and also just navigate. But there are some steps that Bat Conservation International has proposed that can help mitigate those effects.
So northern long-eared bats, they're more forest dependent than some other species of bats. They really like intact canopy and denser forest than like the tricolored bat, which is sort of more of a habitat generalist. So like if people wanted to help bats by putting up bat boxes in their backyard or planting shagbark hickory trees or something like that, that would help probably other species more than the northern long-eared bat. You think?
Yeah, unfortunately.
All right, you're gonna like this question. How large of an animal can the American burying beetle bury, and how long does it take?
Oh man, I don't know. I've never clocked one. But they can bury things up to, I think, 6 ounces is kind of the general limit. So they have to be pretty small. You know, think like a rat or a pigeon, something along that size.
Is it known why the burying beetles require undisturbed soil? Is it because of the presence of specific fungus or something?
No, it's just so that they don't get interrupted as they're trying to hatch and raise their young. So, I mean, if you dig up their den, you know, their burrow, as they're trying to, you know, as their larvae are pupating, it won't be successful. You know, that pair of American burying beetles won't survive, and none of their young will either. So that's why they really need the undisturbed soils, just so that they're left in peace as they try to raise their young.
Back to the bats, you mentioned UV radiation or trying to treat the caves. Are there any studies about temperature regulation during hibernation? Like, it seems like it would be tough to treat an entire cave.
Yeah, and it's a bit of I would think it's a little bit of a double-edged sword there, where the bat wants to be hibernating. You know, they're saving up their energy over the winter because they don't really have any available prey. And so they want to be in kind of that hibernatory stupor where they're not using a lot of resources. And so they want a cooler cave for that. Unfortunately, that's also the conditions that white nose syndrome really likes. And so that's kind of the tragedy of white nose syndrome and why it has been so devastating. It likes the exact same conditions that the bats do during winter. And also the caves, one of the reasons bats are in the caves is that they already are very thermoregulated. You know, the interior of a cave doesn't change much from summer into winter. So yeah, I don't think that heating the cave would necessarily work, but I also had never heard of a study trying that particular method.
So I think I just created some confusion talking about bat boxes and talking about how the northern long-eared bat is very forest dependent, more so than other bats. So people are wondering if they should put up bat boxes and if it does help. And yes, it absolutely does. There's lots of different species of bats, and some of them would be very happy to have a house in your backyard and eat your bugs. I would recommend looking at the reviews on the bat houses to make sure you get a good one, and being careful like where you install it on the right side of the tree, just to make sure that you get the technical parts right so that the bat can actually use it. Mm-hmm. Is there a bat house we recommend? I will look that up before Slack tomorrow. I was actually I hope my sisters aren't watching this. I'm going to get them bat houses for Christmas. I've actually been looking into this in the past week, and there's lots that have pretty decorations, and I'm like, should I get the pretty one? And then I'm like, well, I should probably get the functional one. So don't tell them that's what they're getting.
Yeah, just use nice wrapping paper.
Has white nose syndrome affected animals other than bats?
I don't believe so, but it really has impacted multiple species of bats. Some are doing slightly better than northern long-eared bats, like little brown bats. There have been some documented cases of them surviving white nose syndrome, but it's still pretty devastating. I mean, we're really talking about silver linings here, unfortunately. You know, with northern long-eared bats, it's usually like a 100% mortality rate. And with little brown bats, it's been closer to like 95, 96. So it does affect other bat species, but I've never heard of it affecting non-bat species.
Yeah, I haven't either.
It's not to say that maybe they don't get it. I just don't think that they necessarily are, it has the same kind of mortality rate, because it's really this combination of the bats providing a good host and them being in hibernation. And so they're not getting any kind of nutrients or anything to try to fight off the fungal disease.
Little brown bats aren't in as much hot water as northern long-eared bats, but they're also in really big trouble and should probably also be protected. The service back in 2013 said they were going to voluntarily protect them, and they haven't done it yet.
And they continue to say that they're working on it, but I'm not holding my breath.
Fungus is kind of terrifying. White nose is a fungus. They think it came over from caves in Europe, and then the animals over there are used to it. It's kind of like chytrid fungus, or BD, which is affecting amphibians, which is like a novel disease that has been a primary driver in amphibian decline.
And I think one of the other tragic things is that they think it was probably spread unintentionally by cavers. Just on their clothes, on their boots or whatever, as they go spelunking. And so it's a note that if you like to go caving, you can look to groups like Bat Conservation International and see the kind of processes that they go through to make sure that they're fully decontaminated before they go into any cave, so that you're not accidentally spreading white nose syndrome from one cave to another. At this point, if you're on the East Coast, the bats have already done it, but it's certainly a concern, you know, out west where it really hasn't established itself yet. One of my friends is one of the cavers for Bat Conservation International, and they go through a very rigorous protocol to sanitize their gear before they go into any cave.
So we've talked about bats and beetles. Now let's get to the harvestman questions. What role do harvestmen play in the ecosystem? I guess they're talking about the cave ecosystem in particular, but you can expand beyond that if you want to.
Sure. Well, so cave ecosystems are really unique. And in all honesty, not a ton is known about them. They're pretty darn hard to study, because if you think about it, when we think of these caves, the ones we think of are the ones that we can actually fit into. I'm trying to remember the name of the cave that we went to in like Kentucky as kids. But, you know, like those are the caves that we're thinking about. In reality, the vast majority of the harvestmen's habitat are these tiny little micro caverns that we could never fit into. You know, they're a couple inches tall, a couple of centimeters tall or something like that. But within their ecosystem, they do perform an important role, basically helping in the decomposition process. So they eat a lot of detritus that falls down into the caves, whether it's crickets or plant matter and the like, and they've really kind of created this unique ecosystem onto itself of these highly specialized cave species. And I think that one of the important things that Congress recognized when it passed the Endangered Species Act is that it's important to protect ecosystems that we really don't know much about, precisely because we don't know much about them and they may provide answers to questions we haven't figured out how to ask yet. And so, for instance, one thing that scientists are currently studying with some of these cave obligates is how their metabolism works. Because they get far less food than most creatures on the surface, they have an incredibly slow metabolism rate, and they live, relatively speaking, very long lives compared to similar creatures on the surface. And so these ecosystems may be really important for reasons we don't even know yet.
Someone asked if there's endangered harvestmen in other cave systems, like in Florida's karst caves, for example.
I'm not sure off the top of my head. I'm only familiar with the ones in Texas. I imagine so.
I don't know if there's harvestmen in Florida, but there's so many endangered crayfish that live in caves in Florida that are specific to an individual cave or areas of connected caves, and they're really sensitive to water pollution, but also to groundwater pumping. So all the people in Florida, as the fresh water is pumped out, so many cave creatures are endangered by that.
Yeah, cave creatures are also really unique because they become isolated due to one thing or another, and so they can really evolve in these really unique ways, even in close proximity to one another. That's why there are so many different species of harvestmen within the general Austin area. They may all have a common ancestor, but over the eons they've differentiated into multiple different species.
There's 2 ESA questions. We have a couple of minutes left. Does public pressure help to get the Fish and Wildlife Service to protect species?
Yeah, sir. All right. So apparently my dad has chimed in and said it was Mammoth Cave that I couldn't remember the answer to. But yes, public pressure certainly does help. And I'd say keep an eye on our action alerts. When the Fish and Wildlife Service does things like proposes to downlist the American burying beetle or delist gray wolves and the like, it's important to submit comments and let your voices be heard by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and that you want these species to retain the life-saving protections that they need.
All right, you have 1 minute to answer this question, but okay. I bet you can do it. It's about the listing process and if Congress can list a species or unlisted, or if the president can list or unlist a species.
Well, so the president has, is the executive in charge of ultimately the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the president, Secretary Bernhardt, and then Fish and Wildlife Service itself. And the service itself can propose to list or downlist or delist a species. Unfortunately, they almost never do anymore. Species really only get listed as a result of citizen suits like the one the center brings all the time to protect species. Congress can pass a law essentially delisting something and saying that it's not, that it can no longer enjoy the protections of the Endangered Species Act. There's been a lot of talk recently about like sage-grouse riders from Wyoming senators and the like, looking to delist the species through legislation rather than through regulation. And so that's an important reason to, hold your representatives accountable, because they can delist things.
Well, thank you so much, Ryan, for doing this webinar tonight. Thank you to you at home for joining us, and to Karina, who's behind the scenes running tech. Next week, our webinar is going to be about how you can help protect wolves. And our executive director, Kieran Suckling, is going to give a special statement at the beginning of that webinar. The week after that, we're going to talk about the native bees of Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument with a new film about them that we're going to show you, and the filmmaker is going to be on there too. Ryan and I will be on Slack tomorrow at noon. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.